Thank you, Peter, and thanks to all the participants who've come in many instances from considerable distances, as far as California and Sweden, but also everyone who's come from close by to take part in this. And it's been just such a pleasure for the two of us to put this together, and I've been so looking forward to this. So I want to thank you all. I also want to thank everyone else who is here, and I hope you don't mind looking at the back of my head. It's much more attractive to look at the back of Anne's head, which is very, very carefully groomed, is much more...
I think the backs of our heads are actually quite similar.
Well, be that as it may, I also want to thank our colleagues at the Museum of Modern Art in the Object Lab. Yesterday we assembled there as the guests of Roger Griffith to look at work and think about some of these puzzles in the presence of some real things. And I think the chance to do this in a lab with conservators was really enlivening. So now we move on to today's explorations, and we have some introductory remarks to make, but before I hand over to Anne, I just want to say that we want to acknowledge a great debt to the Lichtenberg Kolleg, the Advanced Study Institute of the University of Göttingen, where we have been fellows, and through those fellowships we were able to develop this project. So it was
That's
thanks to Martin van Gelderen, the director, and Dominic Huniger, now former executive director, and the president of the university, Ulrika Bicycle, that we were able to do this. So
that's right. I just want to second all of those. Thanks.
I want to thank the most obvious person to thank, and that's Antonio Sanchez Gomez. Who's here.
Yes, thank you, Antonio. Absolutely.
Antonio has looked after us and made everything happen. So many thanks. Sorry.
I'm just checking.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay.
I'm done. Yeah.
So, almost 20 years ago now, Ivan and I spent some time at the Museum of the Art Institute in Chicago looking at two figurines. So here's one of them up here. These are polychromed wooden sculpture that are about 20 inches tall, made in China sometime between 480 and 221 BCE. We both felt instinctively that a considerable part of the aesthetic interest of these figurines was the way in which they had, you might say, disintegrated. Now, to be sure, they're in great shape. They really are for 2,000-year-old polychromed wood. Nevertheless, even the most cursory inspection reveals breakage and considerable erosion and fading. This degradation of materials, we continue to be convinced, is an important part of what makes these figurines aesthetically compelling. Degradation is what lends their surfaces complexity and depth. It enhances their attenuated elegance, and it softens their forms, rendering facial features and drapery subtle and nuanced. It's our idea that these figurines are better off, aesthetically speaking, precisely because of the so-called ravages of time, than they would have been in their pristine state. Although, of course, this claim relies on a counterfactual that we can't, in fact, confirm. But
let's consider another example, the Peplos Kore in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, which is a white Parian marble female figure dating from approximately 530 BC, and it was excavated on the Acropolis in 1886. Now, although damaged, the statue bears some traces of original paint, and it's common knowledge that many Greek and Roman marble statues were originally brightly colored, and traces of paint on the Peplos Kore have allowed the German archaeologist Vinzenz Brinkmann to propose a reconstruction of the original polychromatic paint scheme. That reconstruction, along with others, was included in the exhibition Gods in Color at the Harvard Art Museums and elsewhere in 2007-2008. The color is more than merely surprising, and you see it there on the right. These colors are loud, brassy, garish, lacking any subtlety. Indeed, many people, ourselves included, find the polychrome replica of the Peplos Kore, ostensibly presented as the original would have looked, aesthetically inferior to the statue in its current state. Much the same can be said for many other examples of Greek and Roman statuary excavated from the 15th century onwards that were originally brightly polychromed, but whose color has been attenuated through deterioration or above or below ground. In such cases, we would contend that degradation is an aesthetic gain.
So, why are these observations interesting? To begin with, we should note that decay and degradation hold an ambiguous place in much contemporary European-derived thought. On the one hand, people across the world take a nostalgic, sentimental, and even admonitory delight in ruins, while on the other hand, people and institutions strive to arrest and even reverse the ravages of time on a wide range of tangible things. Conservators are among the foremost in consistently battling the ravages of time. The phrase, the ravages of time, is a telling one. It occurs in the founding documents of both the Massachusetts Historical Society, 1791, and the American Antiquarian Society, 1813. All those things mentioned as serving to, quote, rescue the true history of this country from the ravages of time, or to, quote, retard the ravages of time, and are subject to curatorial and conservation care in these and many other institutions. This is still the institutional norm, even in spite of an increasing recognition that to use things up selectively may be better than to not use them at all. The dominant ideal of such depositories as libraries and museums remains to preserve their collections in perpetuity. The difficulty, as we see it, lies not only in addressing contradictory attitudes toward decay and degradation, admired in some circumstances, regretted in others, but also in adequately describing and explaining these phenomena themselves. When do aging and degradation aesthetically improve an artifact, and when not?
So our point is that although scholars in various disciplines, notably art history, have at times discussed the aesthetic value of degradation, the European philosophical tradition, to our knowledge, lacks any theorization of aging or degradation as positive aesthetic values. By contrast, Japanese aesthetics, for example, has a concept for the aesthetic value of temporal degradation, sabi. This tradition also incorporates a celebration of repaired damage by drawing attention to the edges of mended ceramic shards with gold, kintsugi. Inspired by these notions, we are attempting, in our own collaboration, to identify and make precise the contours of the aesthetic values of degradation in all its varieties, and to offer considerations that lend the phenomenon credence in terms of our own philosophical, art historical, and museological understanding.
Oh, thank you. In our current project, I was so busy looking at those, which are extraordinary.
Yeah.
In our current project, we aim to ascertain how degradation, aging, and temporality more broadly can play a positive aesthetic role in artifacts. How might the very fact of permanence or impermanence, durability or fragility, endurance or destruction, stasis or change affect an artifact aesthetically? When and why are decay and decomposition worthy of our admiration? And why do these sometimes become features of objects to prevent or repair? How do some artists include markers of temporality, in particular aging and deterioration, in their works? How should conservators deal with works as they deteriorate, even if deterioration has led to aesthetic improvement? How should conservators deal with works that are designed to deteriorate?
So in the course of attending to such questions in our collaborative work, we hope to argue for our central thesis that artifacts can improve aesthetically precisely because they age, degrade, or deteriorate. More specifically, we argue that certain sorts of decline, which involve worsening along some axis, can nevertheless result in positive aesthetic worth. Degeneration to an inferior state is the very process that leads to positive aesthetic improvement, and this is the seeming paradox at the heart of our inquiry.
So we'd like to end by making some distinctions that we hope will be helpful for our discussions today. So this is the first set of distinctions. I know.
Yes.
I know. So in thinking about temporal change, we can distinguish between normative and non-normative ways of conceiving of temporal change. We're just going to say change for short. So non-normative conceptions of change do not imply any evaluation, even of the weakest sort. They don't imply any kind of norm. There's not some state that an object ought to occupy, nor is there a state toward or away from which a thing transforms. So non-normative change concepts are also non-teleological. Examples of non-normative change concepts are those that delineate bare bones chemical and physical changes.
So physical change, as you all know, is an alteration of the extensive properties of a substance, its shape, whether it's solid, liquid, or gaseous, to confine discussion to three states of matter in everyday experience. Its molecular constituents remain constant, although parts may be subtracted or other substances added without affecting the molecular structure of the material to which any addition is made. And such changes are theoretically, though not always practically, reversible. Chemical changes, and we're now here, chemical changes are of two types: the combination of two or more materials to make a new distinct material, and the decomposition of a material into two or more distinct materials. Both involve a recombination of atoms into new molecular structures that were not previously present. Chemical changes, whether inorganic, organic, or biochemical, cannot be reversed other than by further chemical changes. And some processes of change productive of the appearance of aging are simple, whether physical or chemical. Others are complex, involving one or more identifiable constituent changes that may be either chemical or physical, or a combination of both. And I hope you're not lost.
Both physical and chemical change can entail one or more of the following observable phenomena in any given thing. So the first is, so we're just over here under non-normative at the bottom there. These are just examples of chemical change. Physical and chemical change. So subtraction, when a given thing is subject to loss. For instance, solid parts may be worn away by friction or wind-borne particles, water, or other solids. Similarly, solid parts may be dissolved by the chemical action of acid rain or inadvertent spillages. So subtraction is one. Plasticization is the deformation of a solid by means of tensile stress, ductility, or compression, malleability, with or without increase in temperature and without fracture. Substitution.
Which I missed out. I'm sorry.
Substitution, which Ivan missed out.
Yeah, on the slide.
Substitution may entail a change of shape or surface without loss of mass or volume, as when the surface of a solid thing reacts chemically with another substance to produce a new surface, such as patina, rust, or tarnish. Accretion, when an increase in mass or volume by the addition of a substance, whether chemically or physically, that was not previously present. And disintegration, the disaggregation of some or all of the physical and chemical constituents of a thing, as when a dry leaf crumbles to dust. Many things are subject to one or more or all of these phenomena, consecutively or simultaneously. Change is rarely simple. Oh, it's still me. Oh, I see. Normative changes. Normative temporal change concepts. I should just say, actually, we should have written this to say that teleological change concepts that involve some kind of a goal or end state, are just one example of normative, rather than, there are other sorts, but that's the one we were talking about here. So these, by contrast, do posit a state that an object ought to occupy or instantiate, a state toward which or away from which the object is transforming. Consider, for instance, our many teleological change concepts, according to which a thing is either on its way up, it is growing, developing, composing, organizing, maturing, etc., or on its way down, declining, degrading, decomposing, disorganizing, and so on. And I just want to say we've had a lot of conversations about just this very important distinction here. And I think we often started with thinking about our own bodies. If I get bigger, now I'm not growing. There's something else happening. There was a time when my getting bigger counted as growing, and then it doesn't. And that isn't just, there are things that one can say about that, but it just sort of points out how deeply teleological this on our way up or on our way down, some of our change concepts are, and how much big a role that plays, I think, in the stuff that we're talking about.
From temporal change, we want to distinguish rates of change concepts. So second, we distinguish a variety of these rates of change concepts. Change can be accelerated, delayed, arrested. What's important to notice about these is that they're normative in the sense that the change described is relative to some norm, a norm which can be provided by the goal or end state, as with normative change concepts, or derived from the type to which the thing belongs, or given by the needs of a preserver. For instance, acid paper is said to age prematurely, that is, faster than paper ought to age, but not faster than acid paper ought to age. So the norm appealed to here is not derived from its type, that is, not from the type acid paper, but rather from some ideal that is approximated by comparable types such as acid-free paper. So we would make a distinction between, in the first place, those things that are changing faster or more slowly than others of its type, and second, those things that are changing faster or more slowly than others of a comparable type. To be clear, here we're comparing types, albeit neighboring types seen as comparable along some axis. There are two different sorts of reason to set one type as the norm for the other or others. That is, to take acid-free paper, for instance, as the norm against which one assesses longevity or durability of other forms, of other papers containing acid. First, one type fulfills a function better than another. Second, one type fulfills needs of appreciators better than others. Now, that said, there's a small subset of objects, in particular those things made as art, that have no function other than that of meeting the needs of the appreciator. But we want to emphasize that this is a very small subset of the tangible things that exist in this world.
The third set of distinctions we want to make here is a distinction from conservation and archival sciences between externally generated change and what has come to be called inherent vice, which I just learned is also the name of a movie that I have not seen. Inherent vice, not the movie, is the tendency of an artifact or a natural object to deteriorate because of fundamental instability of its components. While, of course, all things, living and non-living, have some degree of inherent vice owing to entropy, the term is meant to pick out inherent features of objects that make them particularly unstable and prone to self-destruction. We already mentioned acid paper, which is one example. Another is cellulose acetate film, which eventually becomes brittle, shrinks, bubbles, and discolors, more or less in that order. As is clear from the term inherent vice, this is an explicitly normative concept.
So this example from Bill Morrison's movie Decasia, a compilation of reproduced decayed film footage, brings us to another set of distinctions. We should distinguish between represented degradation and actual degradation. Also, we should distinguish between intentional degradation and inadvertent degradation. The sculptor Richard Serra, for instance, contrives and plans for a certain degradation of the surfaces of his works in Corten steel. Some works in bronze, although they have suffered from undesired, inadvertent, and irreversible degradation, known as bronze disease. So this is an inadvertent, unwanted, usually, form of degradation.
The final set of distinctions we'd like to introduce are the variety of ways of valuing an artifact on account of its having aged and degraded. And these, I should just say, these are conceptual distinctions. We mean to acknowledge that that any given object might instantiate multiple of these. So the first is rarity. These are cases where things are considered more valuable because of their rarity, where this is a direct effect of their being quite old, and so there being fewer of that type extant. For instance, antiques and postage stamps. The next is what we were calling they don't make them like they used to. We were just talking about washing machines this morning. Older things valued because they were made according to higher standards with better materials or workmanship. A different kind of phenomenon is what we're calling the Stradivarius phenomenon, things that improve with age according to a functional standard. So, for instance, wooden instruments that sound better with age. And here we just mean to distinguish things that improve with age in the sense that what you can do with them improves with age. Sentimentality, value ascribed to things because they've been in one's possession for a long time or in someone else's possession for a long time. Now, we think that ruins might be an example of this, although it may well be that some of our experts here on ruins will tell us otherwise. The test of time is a different way of valuing something. This is where a thing's appeal lasts, so people think, because of the thing's superiority. This isn't quite a case of valuing something because of its age, but its age in conjunction with lasting approval is taken as a marker of the thing's value. The next is authenticity, where traces of the past are open to us, that open us onto history, and so give us a sense of, give us a kind of window into some authentic bit of historical past. And the last is what we were calling the Driftwood Phenomenon, and this is actually the one I think that most interests us, where things become more beautiful or accrue other kinds of aesthetic value with age, as in the case of driftwood, things that were perhaps not once beautiful but become so because of age. And I was thinking that we might add to this, or perhaps this is just a kind of sub-case of the Driftwood phenomenon, but Professor Honda talks about palimpsest in her book. Yes. And I've been thinking about palimpsest as I think of it as maybe a kind of the Driftwood phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it needs to be its own, but
we can work on that over the next 20 years. What we've just offered by way of an introduction doesn't even begin to address the question of active matter. We're not concerned with defining the activity of matter for, as we've discussed in the symposium with which this series opened, all matter is mutable, no matter is wholly inactive. And this state of affairs is really not particularly interesting from a philosophical viewpoint. What matters, surely, is how we conceive of that activity in all its variety. In particular, when is matter's activity something to attempt to prevent, avoid, or arrest, and when is it something to celebrate, exploit, or even facilitate? Now, the work of the conservator is invariably in vain, eventually, if not immediately. So might we not reconceive it in a more or less radical manner that might lead to an explicit appreciation of conservators' interventions as doomed heroism? We end our introductory remarks with the words of the great English poet John Dryden, who in his 1694 poem To Sir Godfrey Kneller, principal painter to his Majesty, writes, "More cannot be by mortal art expressed, but venerable age shall add the rest. For time shall with his ready pencil stand, retouch your figures with his ripening hand, mellow your colours and embrown the taint, add every grace which time alone can grant. To future ages shall your fame convey, and give more beauties than he takes away. So with those attempts to map this terrain, I hand over to Anne to chair the first session proper.